David, welcome to the Dallas Fed.
Thank you.
And before we start, I'm just going to ask, because I always like to do this, how many people are coming to the Dallas Fed for the first time? Still a good number. Okay, good. And how many have been here before? All right, that's great. All right, we'd like to keep coming, keep bringing friends. We're glad you're here. As I've said many times, those of you in here before have heard me say, we have 30 PhD economists here, and we do an enormous amount of surveys and work with businesses in this district, but your involvement here and being able to talk to you and pick your brain and get your views is critical to what we do. So thank you for being here, and that's why we're doing these programs, is to open the Dallas Fed all through this district up to the community, and it's owned by the community. We want to make it so you come here and feel like you're welcome here and part of the Dallas Fed, so we're glad you're here. David, I've been trying to get David, I forget, when we first sat down, it was well over a year ago, and I've been trying to get him here because David is one of the most articulate voices, I think, on the economy. He was explaining to me today, he sits down the hall from Ben Bernanke, now Janet Yellen, Don Cohn, and others who used to be at the Fed, and I guess Ben, you said, just came in and asked you if you want to have lunch.
No, he said, the former Open Market Committee is going to lunch. Do you want to come?
So that's pretty cool.
Every once in a while I say, how did I end up in this position?
So let me start, David. Tell us, because you've done a lot of things, obviously, very prominent journalist for a long time. How do you spend your day now, and how do you spend your time at Brookings?
I run a little center inside the Economic Studies unit at Brookings, and people have this idea that if you go and work at a think tank, you put your feet up and you think, and then once in a while, when the spirit moves you, you write something. I haven't found that to be quite true for two reasons. One is I don't have a PhD in economics, and you wouldn't want a think tank full of former newspaper reporters, but it turns out that having a few is very useful because there are three things that I do at Brookings that they seem to think are amazing. One is I can write something in less than 6 months. Second, there seem to be a number of people at Brookings of all ages who think it's impossible to get information unless you either find it on the web or send an email. And they seem to be constantly shocked that I call somebody and they tell me something. And the third thing is that I've developed a facility to moderate panels on things I don't know anything about. And a lot of people at Brookings either can't moderate a panel about something they do know something about, or they're afraid to not moderate a panel they don't. So I actually ended up doing a lot of moderating. There is no and I've also, it turns, I'm a lot of a manager. I can tell you this morning before I got on the plane, I was doing performance reviews. So
you are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just tell you a little bit about a couple of things we do to give you a sense of where my energy is. A lot of what we do is commission papers on matters of fiscal and economic policy. So, for instance, we are now engaged in a multi-year effort to improve the quality of the measurement of productivity. There's a lot of debate among experts about whether we're actually measuring the economy well, and it's getting harder to measure. It was much easier to count number of cars or tons of steel than to figure out how do you deal with, are we getting more health care or are we getting better health care? And how do you handle Facebook and Google where we don't really pay for them, at least not directly? So I spent a lot of time we're creating a panel to look on this, talking to economists about what papers we should commission, et cetera, et cetera. At the other end, we wanted to get beyond the audience that usually comes to an event at Brookings to talk about fiscal policy and the budget. So we got some money and built a computer game on the federal budget. It's called the Fiscal Ship, fiscalship.org. And it is deliberately meant to get away from the idea that the only thing that matters is what the debt to GDP ratio is in 2045. That matters, of course, but it's not the only thing. So in order to play the game, which you can play in about 10 or 12 minutes, and it's been played about 400,000 times, so we're pretty proud of that, you pick from a number of goals for government. Could be shrink government, strengthen the safety net, fight climate change, strengthen national defense. And once you pick those goals, we give you about 120 tax cut, tax increase, spending cut, spending increase options. And you win the game if you both stabilize the debt at current levels, about 77% of GDP, and pick policies that, in our mind, meet those goals. And it's been, it's a little bit in the spirit of what you're doing here, Rob. We've played it with lots of groups of college kids. When kids come to Washington for a Washington semester, we bring them in and we assign them, sometimes we assign them goals, and we see how people who have very different goals can get to a stable federal budget from very different ways. And sometimes we let people play their own goals. And one of the most satisfying things to me is then we ask them, sometimes in person, sometimes in a Survey Monkey, what did you learn? And I've done a little teaching. I never done it in a systematic way like this, where you have some learning goals, and then you ask people what did they learn, and they actually mesh. Like people say, I discovered that if you just cut the things I want to cut, you don't do much. You know, I discovered that if you have a carbon tax, you can raise a lot of money. I mean, people, we force them to make choices, but in a playful way. And this is something different than anything I've ever done before. Working with game developers is fantastic.
And anyone can this audience can log in?
Fiscalship.org. No, you don't have to put your name.
What's it called again?
Fiscalship.org.
Fiscalship.org.
So that's the range.
So can I ask, can you win the game without doing entitlement reform?
You can win the game if it's hard. You have to raise the hell out of taxes.
I see. And if you do entitlement reform, you still may have to raise taxes.
Yes.
Just
Depends how much you want to cut them.
Okay. And so on that happy note, the recent tax legislation and budget deal, although I guess we're playing this game for real, I've talked a lot about the fact that our view is it'll create a short-term bump in GDP, and the impact will trail off over the next few years. What do you see as the impact of that legislation plus the budget deal?
So
you can take them in pieces if you want.
No, I think it's pretty clear that we're going to get a nice boost from tax cuts and spending increases in the next 12 to 18 months. You don't have to be a dyed-in-the-wool Keynesian or have a PhD in economics to know that if you give people a lot of money and they spend it, we'll get more economic growth. The problem is, I think, twofold. One is the economy's doing pretty well now, and we're pretty close to full employment, so we may not need that boost. And so Rob and his colleagues at the Federal Open Market Committee may be forced to raise interest rates more than they would have otherwise to slow that down. And you can ask him later exactly how much they're going to raise interest rates on what day.
That's fair. That's why we're here.
I think that, no sober analyst, and that includes some people I don't agree with, thinks this thing will pay for itself. And so we could have had a real constructive tax reform law that cut the corporate tax rate, did away with a lot of deductions, credits, broadened the base, and didn't blow such a big hole in the deficit. I think we're going to, after the 1981 Reagan tax cuts, Reagan and his advisors realized they'd done too much, and there were a series of tax increases over the next several years. I don't know that will happen, but I wouldn't be surprised. The spending bill shocked me, and then I realized how naive I was. Because when you have gridlock in Washington and nobody agrees, what's the easiest thing to do? You guys get the things you want, you guys get the things you want, and we'll all vote for the bill, and that's what happened. So I think it's a shame. I think that the tax cut will increase economic growth. I think it does have some good investment incentives, but I don't think they're quite as big as the proponents think. And I think that the cost of having all that debt will counter that.
So,
and also, they didn't do anything about entitlements. Yeah. So you get a bunch of congressmen in a room. What's the biggest problem with the federal budget? Entitlements, retirement benefits, health care. We got to do something about that. So when they get done celebrating that they managed not to close the government this week, which some of them consider that's like in their job description, that's it. I succeeded, I can go home. All they did was a big tax cut, some discretionary tax increases, some of tax some increases in appropriated discretionary spending, some of which are probably wise, but in a different world, the price of getting those good things would have been that they would have packaged it with some entitlement cuts.
Right.
Now, when it gets to the day of dealing with entitlements, they're going to have a hard time giving away other spending increases or tax cuts because packaging them because they've already given them away.
So is that the biggest economic issue you see today, or what is the biggest economic issue you see today?
As you, Rob, asked me about this on the phone, and I have a long laundry.
So I already know its answer, but
laundry list.
still.
So I think the biggest economic problem we have is that our political system is unable to deal with the economic problems we have. We are, in many respects, extremely lucky. We did not have another Great Depression. Any measure of what the economy looks like today compared to was 10 years ago, unemployment, GDP, all those things, we look a lot better than Europe and Japan. And so it's not that we have failed, but it's like a patient who has a heart attack, severe heart attack. We had a terrible heart attack. We were in intensive care for a long time. The recovery was very long, longer than a lot of us thought it would be. But we're kind of back to something close to normal, and it turns out we have a lot of chronic issues. As Rob talks a lot about, we have some demographic challenges. We're an aging society. The pace of productivity growth is slow. We have an inadequate public education system, et cetera, et cetera. And what I find most troubling is this is the moment in the business cycle when you want to deal with those things. We're not trying to rescue the financial system from collapse. We've dealt with a lot of the issues in housing and banks and autos and all that. And so this is the perfect moment to deal with those long-term issues, to make the changes today that will pay off in the future. The investments, both in terms of increased spending, but also in terms of restraining the growth of entitlements that we can't afford. And we're not doing that. And so I can give you a long list of things that worry me about the economy. But people like me, I'm very careful about, it's worse than it used to be. When I came to Washington as a reporter in 1987, the 64-year-old reporter said, it's worse than it used to be, And so there's a danger there. But let me tell you something, it's worse than it used to be.
So in that regard, you and I have also talked about this issue, the role of the press and particularly the polarization of the press. How's that factor into this?
Well, I think that one reason our political system is dysfunctional, not the only reason, but one reason is that we're a pretty polarized society. People tend to live near people who agree with them. Even if we had perfectly fair redistricting of districts, we would have some polarization. Now, in many respects, we've made a lot of progress in this country. It's worth remembering that it was 50 years ago today that Martin Luther King was killed. And for many black people in America, life is a lot better than it was for black people in America 50 years ago. Not for all of them. And the gap between whites and black is still alarmingly wide. But in many respects, things have gotten better for a lot of African Americans. And in fact, surveys show they're more optimistic than a lot of white people are. But I think the press is both a reflection and a cause of what's going on. A reflection in that most of the press is interested in making money, which means getting viewers or listeners or readers. And it turns out that in a world where everybody can get their opinions confirmed by what URL they type in, that there's a lot of money to be made by being extreme. And one of the tensions at the Wall Street Journal was and they still don't think of themselves as being particularly partisan. They have a very conservative editorial page, but the news page has always tried to steer. I used to tell people I don't take credit or blame for the editorial page because if you take credit when people like it, then the next month you're in trouble when they blame. So the mainstream, call it as you see it, press is under pressure. Some mainstream press has become pretty partisan. And so that is both a reflection of the fact that's how you get viewers or readers or listeners, But it's also a cause because I think too many people only read or believe what they already thought was true. I mean, I tell people sometimes it was a lot easier in the days when I started the Wall Street Journal and the internet didn't exist. So if there was some rumor and we checked it out and it wasn't true, we didn't print it and you didn't know about it. Now, every rumor is on, and people call the journal and complain. Why didn't you report that, John Kerry actually won the election? If you guys had, and you say, well, we checked that out and it's not true. Well, I read it on Drudge or I heard it on MSNBC. So there's like no filter, there's no sense that they're the mediating function of the press.
So without getting into the politics of it, obviously there have been a lot of particularly recent criticisms of the press, its veracity, fake news, all that. You were a reporter for many years. What is your assessment, and we won't talk about all media, but of the big publications, FT, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, you pick the others, Washington Post, we've come under a lot of criticism, plus the television media, various forms. What's your assessment of the credibility and the criticisms of these organizations?
First of all, the criticism comes with the territory. I'm drawing a blank on that new movie about Watergate and Ben Bradley and Catherine
The Post.
Yeah, The Post. So it's not like, and I don't know if anybody saw that movie. The absolute best part of the movie is that when Nixon is talking, it's actually Nixon talking because he taped his own phone calls. So it's not some actor reading Nixon's line or somebody remembering what Nixon said. It's actually Nixon saying, I don't want any Washington Post reporters at the White House ever again, including at my daughter's wedding. So it comes with the territory. I think my first approximation, the press is doing its job. We have a free press. We have the First Amendment because the founders believed it was important to have a check on government. And I'm pretty proud of my colleagues for standing up and taking the heat. I think some of it has been really, really ugly. I have a young woman who used to work for me at the Wall Street Journal who's now at CNN. And she literally thought she might have to wear a bulletproof vest when she covered Trump rallies because they put all the reporters in a pen and then the president or the candidate Trump would scream at them and everybody would turn around and throw apples at them and stuff. I think that so that's that. The press, the mainstream press, in some instances, has decided to go into opposition to the president, become a little bit more like the European press. So I have a lot of respect for the New York Times, but I think sometimes it's a little hard to see the line between the New York Times editorial page and the news stories. So I worry a little bit about that. Third, there were an awful lot of people in the mainstream press who were absolutely stunned that Donald Trump won the election. That suggests that they weren't really doing their jobs. A little too much people like us, a little too much, I don't know anybody who voted for Trump, so therefore the only people who voted for Trump must be redneck, racist, ignorant thugs. And I think that taught the press a lesson that diversity in the newsroom does not only mean having women and Hispanics and African Americans, but having somebody who actually maybe owned a gun or who grew up in Topeka, Kansas, instead of in Manhattan. I think that's been reinforced, and I think people realize that. I think that's good. And then finally, I used to say that it's a lot more fun to cover an industry being subject to technological change than be employed in one.
You're right.
And there's an enormous amount of pressure on our mainstream news organizations. Just to reinforce how old I am, when I joined the Wall Street Journal, it was a 5-day-a-week paper. So once in a while I worked on Sunday, and Friday afternoon was pretty light. Now it's a 24/7 paper. And the pressure on the staffs to produce, to be the first one to report something, to keep up with the proliferation of websites has put a lot of pressure on the quality and thoughtfulness of the press. And there's too many reporters, I think, who are spending time tweeting or writing 300-word blog posts instead of trying to figure out, so what is it about immigration that makes it so polarizing? Or what is the best way to finance infrastructure? Or could we change our healthcare system so we get better quality without spending more money, or whatever? And so I worry that they're being pulled into this short-term 24/7 thing.
So let me just ask you one follow-up on that, and then I'm going to switch to another topic, more mundane, the Fed. One of the things we talk a lot about, here, though, is when you turn on the news and see what's reported, it's all, we may not think of it this way, it's all short-term, cyclical. GDP, stock market, currencies, latest jobs number, in other words, it's short-term oriented, and you don't read a lot of articles or see a lot on television that's about these big structural trends you talked about and we've talked about: demographics, productivity, lagging educational attainment, blah, blah, high levels of government debt to GDP. What is that? You think that's fair, accurate? Is that changed in the last 25 years? That's always been this way.
It's pretty much always been that way.
Okay.
I mean, my excuse for the inadequacies of the Wall Street Journal are that I've discovered it's a lot harder to assign stories once you leave the staff than it was when I was working there.
Okay. All right, that's a fair
I've tried, and we spend a lot of time with reporters. I mean, one thing is that the best economic reporters are pretty darn good.
Yeah, I agree.
There's this great, there was a period of time in the Federal Open Market Committee where they were keeping transcripts, but the members didn't know they were keeping transcripts. It's been ruined now. They all come prepared. It's like boring. Actually, I don't know if you know this, Rob, they made a really major, serious change to the entertainment value. It used to be if someone told a joke at the FOMC. Now, they're lame because, look, it's Fed and economists.
We're not very funny.
It would say brackets laughter. And so whenever the transcripts came out, you get a year's worth of transcripts, all the press would go through and search for the word laughter.
And we get to edit the transcripts.
And I understand they're not going to do that anymore.
Okay.
You're not going to, and believe me, without the word laughter, you won't know if it was a joke.
All right.
So, no, I think it's a problem. But I think the best press, the reason I mention that is there's this one argument in one of the transcripts from a long time ago where there's been a leak. And the issue is, was the reporter smart or lucky? And Greenspan says that, the economic press is getting a lot better. I used to be able to feed them pablum and they just swallow it. They don't do that anymore. So I had that on my bulletin board for a while.
All right, that's funny. All right, so speaking of the Fed, I guess I'll ask it. Over the last several years, and I guess up to the present, what kind of grade would you give the Fed in its efforts to, there's the dealing with the crisis, but I'll just ask you about the part after that, the effort to quote unquote normalize monetary policy. How are we doing?
Well, I'm going to answer slightly different.
Go ahead.
So you can't give the Fed an A grade for the period preceding the crisis. They weren't the only ones who didn't see it coming. Right. In fact, not very many people saw it coming, except for the people who predict the end of the world every Thursday, and then they figure one day they'll be right. So, but there was some mistakes made. I'm partisan on this. I mean, the book to which Mr. Wynn referred, I think the Fed did a terrific job during the crisis. Not that they didn't make some mistakes, but on balance, we have 4.1% unemployment and something like 3.3 here or something, 3% unemployment. What's the employment rate in Dallas?
It's actually, it's also around 4%, but it's the lowest it's been since we've been recording numbers in the 70s.
Right. So on the normalization, so my judgment is pretty good. There was a lot of pressure inside and outside the Fed to move more rapidly to raise rates. And in my opinion, the fact that the Fed didn't move too fast was right. There were people who promised that by today, April 4th, 2018, we'd be in hyperinflation. Mm-hmm. And instead, we're barely inching towards 2%. I think it turns out that running the economy hot brought more people off the sidelines of the economy than I might have anticipated. Right. I think that we had a little when Janet Yellen came to Brookings, we had a little event where Bernanke interviewed Yellen on stage, and Bernanke made the point that all he did was talk about shrinking the balance sheet someday, and the markets went crazy, the taper tantrum. And Janet Yellen managed to do it, and the markets barely flinched and noticed. So you'd have to give some grades for that. And I guess I would say, I think it gets harder from here. We will have a lot of fiscal stimulus. The dollar's weaker than I might have expected. The rest of the world is doing strong. There's going to be more political criticism of the Fed as they raise rates. And so I think it gets harder from here. But I'd say so far, given that you can't really judge monetary policy until some time has passed, from where we sit now, I think it went pretty well. And I think the people who were impatient for more faster tightening are wrong.
Okay.
I like not being a reporter. I can actually
No, that's
say what
interesting.
I think.
And if you had to give one piece of advice from here to the those of us on the Federal Open Market Committee, what would be the advice you'd give us?
So where I have the most experience is not in whether you should raise rates 3 or 4 times this year. I don't know. Is in the increased importance of communicating with the public what you're doing and why.
Yeah.
The Fed has changed a lot from when I came to Washington and started covering it with Greenspan. I think Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen tried. It's not really in their nature.
Right.
They weren't. It was an effort for them. Bernanke went on 60 Minutes. That was a big deal in the Fed communication world. Janet Yellen is a very sincere and warm person, but you would know she was an economist if you talked to her. I think it's going to be, so I think the presidents play an important role in that. I have some reservations about the Federal Reserve System and how the reserve banks work and who chooses the presidents and all that. But frankly, they've abated in recent months. I see the benefit of the ballast of the system, of having some people who aren't. I mean, if the Reserve Bank presidents were confirmed by the Senate, we'd have 9 vacancies in the 12 banks. And I think that it's really going to be interesting to watch Jay Powell in this respect, because he has a lot of experience in speaking in Washington and speaking to public groups. Yeah. He's much more comfortable at it.
He's very good.
As a member of the Board of Governors, he felt strongly that he could help the Fed by explaining more. And once he got confirmed for a full 14-year term, he started doing it more. Somebody did the downside of technology and numbers is that we can now measure everything. And so there are these reading scores about what are you reading are you speaking at an 8th grade level, a 6th grade level? So someone did I think it was Torsten Slok at Deutsche Bank,
I think I saw
a little bar chart on Bernanke versus Yellen versus Powell. And I don't know he had a lot of observations on Powell as chairman, given that it's been a couple months, but Powell speaks in a manner that is easier for non-economists to understand. And I think that will be useful as long as he's explaining good decisions that don't screw up the economy. If you make the wrong decision, being able to explain it well is not enough.
All right, that's good. Let's take some questions from the audience. Are there microphones? I guess there are microphones on the sides and in the middle. So fire away.
I promise shorter
Please,
answers.
You may have to, or you speak loudly or go to the microphone. Either one will work.
You should go to the mic.
I think you got to go to the mic, yes. You may have to line up at the mic. Sorry about that.
So tell me who you are.
My name is Lee Bruner. I'm a member of the HBS community here in Dallas. There are some scenarios that present about 18 months from now, if the tea leaves have been stirred in public the way some of us think they have, that you will have raised rates another 5, 6, maybe 7 times. A lot of people believe the tax stimulus bump will have started to play itself out about 18 months from now. And it's entirely possible that some of the president's bellicosity toward foreign trade will have grown some fruit by then. You'll be 6 months from an election. The president has gone after the DOJ, the FBI, most of our institutions, the federal courts. What happens when he starts tweeting your way on Sunday nights?
So, do you want me to start?
I think that was for you.
Yeah, okay. So I've said this before. I think my primary job is to be, on the one hand, apolitical, but on the other hand, not to shy away from calling out the tough issues and making good decisions and let the chips fall where they may. So I would take something David said. I'd say if there's criticism, it actually comes with the territory. And my job and our job, I believe, is to screen that out, as to the extent humanly possible, remove political considerations and political influence, and do the best analysis we can, call out the tough issues, which we've been trying to do, and make the best decisions we can. And I'm confident, and I intend, and I think we're determined as a group that that's what we'll do.
So it seems like in your opening comments, the elephant in the room, to me, is the entitlement spending, and I worry about that. And I'd ask you, either one of you, to speculate what's going to happen when we get to 80% or 85% of our spending is entitlement. Can you predict what the cataclysm is going to be, or how we're going to prevent it, or how we're ever going to get our politicians to address it? Because it's the most worrisome issue for me.
So one thing is that I'm not sure we're going to have a cataclysmic moment. One of the problems in this conversation is there were a lot of people who warned that if the debt to GDP ratio got to 60% or 65 or 70, the Chinese would stop borrowing our bonds and interest rates would skyrocket and we'd have a calamity. And that hasn't happened. And I think that actually undermined some of the case for doing stuff. So when I make the case, I don't know if we're going to have a crisis. Charlie Schultz, who was a late economist who was at Brookings, who worked for Jimmy Carter, he used to say that the trouble with this stuff is it's like smoking one more cigarette. No one cigarette's going to kill you, but if you keep smoking, it's going to get you in the end. So we already have had a situation where spending... Look, the fundamental problem is very simple. The American people want more in benefits from their government than they're willing to send to their government in taxes. And the members of Congress know that, and they're acting accordingly. We have already seen that a lot of the spending and government spending that one might consider investments has been squeezed, at least until the recent spending bill, because a bigger share of our budget went to entitlements. So what does that mean? It means that we are spending more on retirement, health benefits, veterans benefits, other benefits, and we're spending less on the things, infrastructure, education, R&D, and science, that will help us grow faster in the future. Right. So that's the fact. And we've been lucky. We've borrowed an extraordinary amount of money at amazingly low interest rates from the rest of the world. And if that could go on forever, we should keep doing this. It doesn't seem to me a terribly prudent strategy. So I think the underlying question you have is one that I've thought a lot about and don't have an answer to, is what changes the politics? We've had a couple of crises, that didn't do it. If we had different leadership, yeah, maybe. Maybe some Ross Perot-like figure runs in the next presidential campaign, doesn't win, but prevents the two candidates from, arguing about, which one has the bigger hands or something. I have a lot. My basic line on this is we're not going to have a crisis anytime soon. We have a problem we're going to have to deal with. If we don't deal with it, our kids and grandchildren will suffer. I'm very worried about the next several years, and I have a great deal of faith, word chosen carefully, that we will deal with it.
David, can I ask one follow-up to that? The one counter to that will be, if you're reading, and I know you do, read the Congressional Budget Office report, I wonder how the public will start reacting when we start in the near future announcing trillion-dollar plus deficits, whether that will have an effect on the psyche of this country.
It will be a great talking point for someone who wants to do something about it. But we will have, the budget deficit last year was $665 billion. It'll probably cross $1 trillion next year, not this fiscal year, but next year. I'm not expecting 500,000 people on the mall in Washington with signs saying, "We demand fiscal responsibility." It's going to take some leadership.
Yes, sir.
Well, my question is similar. There's an opinion that's pretty pervasive in some circles that the deficits don't matter at all. Several years ago, many of us remember Dick Cheney making that comment that deficits don't matter. And a couple months ago, I attended a talk by an economist at one of our major universities who basically made the same argument. Some of the things that he argued is that, A, it's impossible for the U.S. to default on his debt, so the debt doesn't matter that much. And second, that when you think about who the overpayments are going to, it's going to us. So it's going to the retirees, it's going to people who are benefiting from the medical care, and therefore the deficits don't matter at all. I wouldn't say at all, but for the most part don't matter. So I have two questions. One is for Mr. Kaplan. Is there a debate within the Fed about whether the deficits matter? And then for Mr. Wessel, how do you respond to that?
So I'll take the easy part. For me, I've been raising this, and the transcripts will show, I guess, 5 years from now, at the Federal Open Market Committee. And you're not going to see great economic research on this, although we do some at the Dallas Fed about other countries that have been through this. My own 2 cents would be, when our whole lives, everyone in this room, just judging by probably similar age or in the neighborhood of me, we've been leveraging up our entire lives, and it's stimulative, including recently. If we get to the point where we, at a minimum, have to start moderating debt growth, it tells me that in the next recession, we're probably not going to have fiscal capacity to deal with it. And we may get to a point when you start getting trillion-dollar-plus deficits, and you've got this amount of debt to sell. We've got a big supply we're selling. And central banks around the world are talking about shrinking their balance sheets, whether this won't, in fact, there won't be a political push, even though we don't see it now. And that will, in fact, be a headwind for economic growth. So my only comment is, this amount of debt to GDP, I think, in the near term, actually gives us a boost. In the longer run, I worry it might be a headwind. And David mentioned this, the number one things we need to invest in this country are early childhood literacy, secondary education, and skills training. You need some money to do it. So I think at a minimum, it's a factor we ought to at least think about. Last thing, with this amount of debt, we should recognize the economy is very interest rate sensitive. So David talked about we've been lucky to finance at very low rates. Imagine we had 200 or 300 basis points, and we'd have historically low rates. Imagine the impact on debt service as a percentage of GDP. So I think this is a very dangerous. I used to be an investment banker. If you had a company doing this late in the cycle, you'd be counseling them, take the opportunity to leverage. Even though this hadn't caught up with us, I think it's very dangerous, and it needs to be a factor we think about. I believe in around the table in my job.
I think that anybody who says deficits are good or deficits are bad should be ignored, because it depends. Partly it depends where you are in the business cycle. Big deficits in 2008 and 2009 were a good idea, and we would be better off if the deficits had been bigger in 2011, 2012. Big deficits today, increasing the deficit today, given where we are in the business cycle, is not a good idea. Secondly, borrowing money is not inherently bad. It depends what you use it for. And so if we were borrowing heavily to finance investment, however you want to define it, investment in human capital and physical capital, or sometimes we borrow heavily because we're fighting a war, then you might feel more comfortable about that. And third, we don't know at what point is this really debilitating. Like, some economists have said 90% of GDP is debilitating. I don't think that's very convincing. But we do know that you can't go on forever with the debt growing faster than the economy. And that's where we are now, much faster, particularly because we're an aging society. And while I agree that entitlement spending is part of the equation, so are taxes. So we can have more, there's a balance. We're going to have tax increases, and we're going to have some cuts in Social Security and Medicare someday. I don't know when, I don't know what order, I don't know who's going to do them, but that's just the reality. And we're going to argue about how to do it. But the notion that somehow we're going to do it all on the spending side, I think is wrong. And the notion that we can get away without doing anything is also wrong. But it's going to be hard to get the politics right.
Good evening. My name is John Vandermosten, and I'm an equity analyst. And a lot of the companies that I cover have profits, cash flows, positive cash flows way out in the future. And with the change in the tax bill from bringing corporate rates down to 21%, I've been changing all my models, right, to reflect that. But what I've actually done is I've not taken it down all the way. And the argument that I'm making is that the states are going to actually have to pick up some of the obligations that the federal government picked up before, and they're going to actually raise rates or raise taxes. And then there's also a probability that you may see a reversal of some of the declines in the federal tax rate that happened for corporates. So I'm just wondering, what criticisms would you give me, if I was presenting that to you, as an analyst presenting a valuation for a company?
So do we get the bill for this?
I'm afraid no.
I would agree with you.
You get dinner, though.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I don't think this is sustainable. I mean, it's kind of remarkable. There are a lot of big companies that were lobbying this thing that never thought they'd get a 21% corporate rate. They would have been the champagne corks at 23 or 24. I have a feeling they'll see that someday.
Yeah, and the only comment, I'll stay away from it, unlike in my previous life, I'd be more willing to talk about this. I think one thing I'm sensitive to is profit margins in the United States, but this is true globally, but certainly not, are at historically high levels. And we know, and I can tell you from all our surveys and everything we're doing at the Fed, while there's wage pressure and some input pressure, businesses have less pricing power today, by and large, than any time in my life because of technology-enabled disruption and other changes. So the danger might be, are you going to see some margin erosion, which may also be part of this. And that's one of the things that it wouldn't shock me to see happen. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So first, I wanted to thank both of you for your time.
Tell us who you are.
Ernesto Valles. So immigration, interesting topic, I think, for all of us. I think what many in the audience would find interesting is that the Central American immigration population in the United States is significantly increasing, while the Mexican immigrant population in the United States is significantly decreasing. What is increasing, though, is more educated, affluent Mexicans, particularly in Texas. I myself went to SMU, and the only Mexican immigrants, quote unquote, that I saw there were more the educated, affluent Mexicans. Do you think there's a particular reason for that, from your view?
I could just give our data on this, just by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And we do a lot of work on immigration here at the Dallas Fed. P. Arrhenius, who may even be here in the audience tonight. Here's what we found. Here's the facts based on our analysis. Over the last 2 or 3 years, it turns out that because apprehensions are up, and also the economic conditions in Mexico, although the last year has been rough, have been improved, we don't see the low-skilled migration from Mexico that we had seen before. And we are seeing that the rise, if there is a rise, is in higher-skilled immigration, okay? So that's that. The only comment we'd also make about immigration, we think immigrants and their children have made up over half the workforce growth in the United States over the last 20 years. And we think over the next 20 years, immigrants and their children will make up 100% of the workforce growth. Now you'd say, how can you say that? Well, we can say it because we know we can forecast native-born workers are actually going to be negative because of, I wish it weren't the case, because of, including for all of us, but it's because of aging, demographics. And so to the extent we grow the workforce, it's going to have to come from immigrants, most likely. And that's been the history of the United States. And one of the distinctive competencies of this country. Now, I lived in Japan for many years. It doesn't have this competence. Other countries are not as receptive to immigrants, but one of the competencies of this country is that we've been very receptive. My grandparents were not born here, for example. And that's a distinctive competence that's allowed us to grow consistently over many, many, many decades. And the only thing we point out at the Dallas Fed, we think our research actually indicates we'd be wise to have more employer-based, skill-based immigration, a la Canada in the United States. But we're also pointing out, if you think you're going to cut legal immigration in half and still grow GDP, GDP is made up of growth in the workforce and growth in productivity. Those two things don't go together. We need immigration and we need appropriate reform if we're going to grow. And given we're so highly leveraged, we need to grow to pay down this debt. So we think this is something this country will have to come to grips with in the years ahead. But yeah, I think you'll see the profile is more the trend toward, and it's been going on for the last few years, more skilled immigration to the extent there is immigration.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up on that. By the way, I appreciate your response. I just think we talked about the media prior, and I just think, I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I was definitely intrigued by that statistic. I think most of us don't realize that, right? Because we see what we hear on the media about the U.S.-Mexico border, and we don't realize that the ones actually coming here, doctors, lawyers, investment bankers. I mean, I myself am a second-generation American, and my mother's a homeowner, taxpayer. Yeah. So it's just, there's definitely some media push that I think makes a lot of people believe what they see. That's not necessarily factual.
So we'll keep saying all this, although our megaphone is not as big as others, but we'll keep on this, because we think if we misdiagnose this, we're going to grow more slowly. And our kids and our grandkids will have less prosperity in this country. And so we'll keep working on it.
Excellent. Thank you.
We haven't talked about tariffs, but I got to ask you.
I was just going to say tariffs so we can.
Yeah, how did I miss that? Okay. Okay, so what's your, I'll start with you. What's your take on what's going on?
I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very interesting that once upon a time we had a lot of tariffs in the United States, and members of Congress realized that it was very hard for them to control themselves because everybody had an interest in protecting the industries in their districts. And so they came up with this great compromise, which is we'll give the president the power to do all this stuff, and then we'll count on him to have the national interest at heart. And presidents tended to be more globalist than individual members of Congress. And it was a great system. And so the president has a lot of authority on tariffs. He can't do very much on taxes and spending. Can't do anything on interest rates. He can do a lot with the military, and he can do a lot with tariffs. And he apparently has figured that out. I think he has a visceral sense of like trade deficits are bad. That I have a friend, Robert Costa, who writes for the Washington Post, who was one of the first reporters to take Trump seriously. And he says when he was on the campaign plane with Trump before there was a big posse of reporters, it was like one of the few things that he felt that Trump really felt strongly about and believed and wasn't flexible on. And so we're showing that. I think we're playing with fire here. Other countries are already, the Chinese already are retaliating. This could be brilliant negotiating. He seems to have managed to get something out of Korea by threatening to tax their steel, tariffs on the steel and not. I think that I think he has picked up an enormous amount of anxiety and hostility towards globalization, some of which is justified. So I think that's one reason why this is popular, because people think that we've somehow lost a lot of jobs because of globalization. They don't tend to think we lost a lot of jobs due to technology. I think we underestimated the effects of China coming into the world trading system, how concentrated they were in certain communities and stuff. I think that too many economists said, on average, it's good, there'll be winners and losers, we'll compensate the losers. Well, the problem is nobody likes to be told they're a loser, and actually we didn't compensate them. So they're pissed, and they vote, and Trump knows that. But one of the great stories in recent human history are the institutions we built after World War II, because we didn't want to do this again. The euro was motivated by old men in France and Germany who'd seen their countries go to war twice in their lifetimes and wanted to build institutions that prevented it. The World Trading Organizations were built because people saw how destructive it was when every country did what it thought was in its own self-interest, but wasn't in the collective interest of the world. And I worry that we're eroding that, and we're opening the door for the Chinese to say, oh, well, if you want to play that way, we're actually better at it than you guys, so game on.
So we've got just a few minutes left. Let me ask you, we've got a lot of very active leaders in the community here in the audience, people here tonight who, when they look to leave here, they'll do things in the community and in the country. Given the issues we've discussed tonight, what would be one piece of advice to people as they leave here? What's something constructive they can go do that you think might help address some of these issues, if they're concerned about some of the things we've talked about tonight?
Wow. I'm not running for office here.
But you give good advice.
So I'm going to give two pieces of advice that are very different. One is, and Joe May didn't put me up to this, but I have for 25 years been impressed how important community colleges are in dealing with almost every one of the issues we talked about here. So that's, I think it's important. You have a good one here. They're not all good. Some of them are lousy. They have a lot of challenges. But there's a reason that every president, sooner or later, ends up on community colleges, because they're looking for that institution that can close the skill gaps, assimilate immigrants, help people who are lost their jobs, want to be retrained. So cherish the community college. And the second thing, at the very different end of the thing, and I've thought a lot about this, as you may have heard earlier, is too many of us talk only to people we agree with. And we have to find ways to get away around that. In some sense, social media is an opportunity. You can read what other people say you don't agree with. I personally find that an unproductive way to spend my time. But I mean, I just think that we have to, if we are a more polarized society, then the only way it's going to change is if individuals make efforts for things to be less polarized, whether it's, it can be people of the same class with different political persuasions, or spending time with people who don't have the advantages that all of us in this room have. And I guess the community college is a good place to do that.
All right, I think that's a good place to end. David, thank you for
Thank you.
being here. Thank you for your leadership.